The calm before the storm. RK equals. Part 3. RK equals. Anara Kuat's residence. Kuat. Anara pinched her arm in the vain hope she had a particularly vivid nightmare. Failing that, she was now convinced that the Sith had driven her insane. At first, she was taken aback how normal Vale appeared. His bearing and manners, his appearance. None of those screamed planet-murdering monster. He was polite, happy-going, normal, even, not so different than a few of the senior officers in Kuat's own fleet she was acquainted with. She should have known better, because almost immediately after proper introductions the conversation turned unreal. "I hear that congratulations are in order." Zash smirked. "I should have expected something like that." "Really?" Vale rubbed the back of his head and smiled disarmingly. "My people were always crazy over their basilisk war droids. A sentient and fully self-aware warship?" He chuckled. "What? What did those insane warmongers do this time?" "When you put it that way." Zash nodded with a gleam in her eye. "That woman is actually good for you. She keeps things interesting, doesn't she?" The Sith's expression shifted. "She does accept me for who and what I am," he agreed. With his wife being a Mandalorian warrior, it was no wonder that she would find destroying whole worlds acceptable. She might find it exciting, the crazy bitch. She married someone like Vale of all people after all. And what was that madness about a self-aware warship? Wisely, Anara said nothing. Gaining the Sith's attention any sooner than absolutely necessary was something she would rather avoid, no matter how pointless such an attempt was. Ahsoka might need someone to vent at further. The Sith was saying. She didn't take meeting Vicky, much less her adoption, in stride. Zash actually laughed at that. "Oh, apprentice, you do know how to stir trouble everywhere you walk. I can just imagine the fallout. I dare any naysayers come complain to Vicky in person, especially once she's fully operational. There will be at least one enthusiast, I'm sure." "There always is, Zash, but we digress. I didn't come just so we can catch up." "Really? You didn't miss your precious old master?" If Anara didn't know better, she would have been convinced that the infernal woman was really hurt by the very idea. "What would I ever do without you? Have to put this little traitor on a leash yourself." Zash's yellow eyes fell upon Anara and made her feel as if something dirty crawled all over her. "There's that. I must say, Madam Kuat, treason does suit you quite well." Vale needled her. That accusation gave birth of indignation in Anara's heart. All she ever did was protect KDY's and Kuat's interests. She was no traitor. In fact, the only traitors she knew of were those holding her prisoner in her own home or planting their assess in the Chancellor's office on Coruscant. "Oh, my," she looks flustered at the very idea. "I should rile you up more often, my dear. Your anger is a much tastier morsel than your bowel-loosening terror." Zash smirked at her. "Less messier too, I reckon," Vale added. All traces of levity vanished from his expression. "You left Corellia fall, Madam Kuat. Your orders are directly responsible for prolonging this war for years and yet might cost us ultimate victory." "As if you care," Anara spat when her anger got the better of her. "You and your kind were never part of the Republic nor on its side. It's your creatures on Coruscant who rule as dictators now. And it was you and your actions who put them there, Anara." Zash purred. "If we're to throw around accusations, you're more guilty than any of us. After all, as you just pointed out, we never had any allegiance towards the Republic. It is merely convenient to work with it." She glared at the impossible woman with undisguised loathing. "Under different circumstances, I would be congratulating you, you know." Vale had the audacity to chuckle at her. "The Jedi Council and people like you achieved what the Sith Empire failed to properly do. The Order is all but gone, the Jedi are on the run, and the Republic itself, why, it was turned into a dictatorship by those most loyal to it in order to save it from itself. Do you really think you'll be able to get away with this?" Anara hissed. She was way beyond caring if it wise to antagonize the Sith or not. Every day more and more people see you for what you are. More systems will turn against you. Vale's expression grew serious. There was time when the Jedi were a direct threat to us, he nodded at Zash. Especially when backed by the Grand Army. 10,000 Jedi Knights leading billions of clones. Facing that would have been an impossible task even for the likes of us, not to mention the rest of the Republic backing them. Today? The Jedi are scattered or on the run, the few loyalists are in my corner. The Grand Army is behind us. Vale's calm and confident smile cut sharper than any blade. The height of irony is that we are among those precious few who actually gave a damn for your rotten Republic, because of self-interest, if nothing else. It's time to reap what you sowed, Madam Kuat. We aren't the Republic nor the spineless Senate. Crossing us will have consequences, and I can assure you, you will live to regret them. Vale leaned forward and his eyes blazed with that sick yellow color. The lights dimmed and Anara could hear voices that soon turned in such an agonized screams the likes of which she hadn't imagined during her darkest nightmares. For a brief moment she heard Bothawui die. Anara saw Vale for what he was, a hungry monster that eagerly waited for her to give him any excuse to do the same to her home. It was then that Kuat knew she was in a hell of her own making and there was no salvation in sight. Her world shrunk to the screaming damned souls Vale consumed and her mind blanked out. == Some time later, Anara came to laying on her couch, with her head resting in Zash's lap. The Sith woman gently massaged her temples and in her, Kuat found an anchor against the house echoing within her mind. She clutched the Sith woman and felt an unfathomable sense of relief when she returned the gesture. "It's going to be all right, dear." Zash smiled gently and ruffed her hair. "You're a good girl. You'll continue to be a good girl and nothing like that would have to happen to Kuat." Anara found herself mutely nodding as she felt elation at the reassurance. Zash looked away, which made her feel disappointment. "It's almost done. I've been working on her for a few weeks now," Zash said. "She'll be ready." "You never disappoint. It's always a pleasure to see a master at work. Anara, do tell me all I need to know about KDY's board of directors," Vale demanded. Anara looked up at Zash for permission and once she got a nod she began talking as fast as she could. == Interlude, Historical Notes, == In Ileana Noreen, is there no simple way to explain the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire? MK, Dr. Merkilex, I'm asked that question quite often, you know. Look just at the core, more than 10,000 senators represented it during the age of the Republic. While many of them did come from a single worlds, many others answered to whole systems or even alliances. There were more reasons for the fall than there were independent polities in the core. There was nothing simple or clean about it, but if I'm to summarize, which will give a grossly warped impression of what actually happened. No matter how educational it might be, we simply don't have the time to go into proper detail, Dr. MK, that figures. Well, let's begin with an example. What did you felt and think when Corellia fell? That's a question I often ask my first-year students. At first, shock. The impossible happened, Corellia fell, and we were no longer safe. MK, you weren't alone in that. How people and governments saw that event illustrates a very important point. Governments, especially democratic ones, need support, they need the people they govern, to believe in them. As you said, when Corellia fell, the people in the core no longer felt safe. Until then, there was no real doubt among the average citizens that the war could and would be won. Despite various setbacks, people trusted Chancellor Palpatine, their governments and the Grand Army. In no small part due to quite successful propaganda, there were certain high expectations about the impending battles at Corellia and Kuat. The thought of defeat, or worse, a disaster, never crossed the mind of the average citizen. People knew that at Corellia and Kuat the enemy would break, that those battles would be the turning points of the war. Instead, Chancellor Palpatine got assassinated, the clones went rogue due to Order 66, and as if that wasn't bad enough, Corellia fell. MK, Exactly. And here things become complicated. Many people and groups saw the fall of Corellia in different light from each other. It was a shock for the citizenry, a wake-up call if you will. We all know how many people came up to the closest recruitment stations after that, many more went out on protests or even began rioting. Certainly. I was a young reporter then covering one of the biggest protests in recorded history on Coruscant. Those were strange days even before Chancellor Palpatine acted from beyond the grave and exposed how corrupt the Senate used to be. MK, speaking about the Senate. Corellia's fall was one of the main factors leading to the stalemate that ultimately doomed the Republic as we knew it. You see, the Grand Army saw the fall in a different light from their civilian leadership. First, it was the significantly more perilous and complicated strategic situation that resulted from that debacle. Second, it was the loss of industry and, as importantly, ships, both operational in battle and in complete construction. Third, and as important, it is well known nowadays that certain high-ranking officers saw the actions of Kuat at the time as a treason and that would color their interactions with the civilian government from then on. You're speaking about the fact that when Chancellor Kenobi got elected it was with the tacit approval and support of the military and not just because she was the wife of General Kenobi, the Supreme Commander of the Grand Army. Support that didn't wane when she had to further consolidate power in the months preceding Republic offensive to retake Corellia and relieve Mandalore. MK, that was indicative of the loss of trust in the various civilian governments and institutions among the Republic military. We come back to the fall of Corellia as an example. We already summarized how the military saw that event, the same for the citizenry. The various governments, on the other hand? It was a public secret that Kuat allowed Corellia to fall. That's how many a government saw it, and that fact further poisoned the already tenuous balance in the Senate. After that perceived betrayal, the trust and support Kuat could enjoy was at all-time low. Bribes, incentives, threats, promises of protection and military aid, none of that was enough to break the stalemate and elect anyone backed by Kuat. The way the Senate got locked up for more than a month without resolution is often cited as the failure of democracy and one of the primary reasons why when it was established the Empire enjoyed such broad support. MK, it helped that the people behind the Empire were the same who made sure we didn't actually lose the war, despite what some people still claim. That's not a wrong supposition. An excellent case can and is often made that the various democratic institutions, not only Republic ones but those of many member states, failed during the war. For me, it's a matter of perception and priorities. A great number of citizens saw one thing in the fall of Corellia, the military something else, and the governments, for too many the danger was past as they saw it. Corellia didn't fall because the separatists were an existential threat to the Republic, much less to their own worlds and systems. It fell because of the Jedi's coup and Kuat's betrayal that ensured their arch-rival got crippled for decades if not centuries. If it wasn't for those events they thought that the separatists would have been crushed during the battles at Corellia and Kuat, and in a year or two, the war would have been all but won. That belief shaped policy in the core to disastrous effect. However, it should be said that those who had it weren't totally wrong. That's one way to put it. As some of our viewers may recall, it was just 2 years ago that the military declassified a great amount of documents from the Clone Wars. MK, indeed. Of particular note are the strategic assessments based on captured intelligence, war games and analysis from GAR High Command on the enemy capabilities and intentions. During their grand offensive, the separatists never intended to capture or even really win at Kuat in the first place. As far as they were concerned, that battle was merely a large-scale raid meant to bind our forces in system in place and wreck as much industry and incomplete construction as possible. Corellia on the other hand. Admiral Trench planned to destroy Corellia's industry, any and all construction underway, and eliminate as much of the Republic's strategic reserve as practical before falling back to Duro and the fixed defenses the separatists had already built in system. At the same time, Admiral Yularen intended to deliver a crippling blow to the enemy's navy. The results of many war games played by GAR High Command remain inconclusive. If it wasn't for the Jedi coup and its fallout, it was possible that the enemy would have suffered a devastating defeat. It is also possible that Admiral Trench would have either won. In fact, the most controversial conclusion among those assessments is that he had better than even odds winning, and thus placing us in much worse military position if it wasn't for Order 66 forcing Admiral Yularen to jump out shortly after arrival in system. MK, that's true. Ironically enough, that's one point both Imperial loyalists and Republic fanatics agree upon. They claim that if it wasn't for the Jedi coup, Admiral Yularen would have won and thus changed the course of history. Many forget or chose to ignore that Trench was the best the Separatists had, and that intelligence recovered later in the war confirms he was confident he could have won even if Admiral Yularen did fight. War games do support the possibility of such an outcome. When the opposing force is commanded by a better tactician, they can and more often than not win during war games. RK equals IN. Kuat in general and Anara Kuat in particular did redeem themselves in the eyes many, though the how of it is one of the most controversial and shrouded in mystery events that lead to the rise of the Empire. What's your take on it, Doctor? MK, Anara Kuat did change her tune a few months later. That's a matter of record, and the same is true of the KDY's board of directors, who at the time for all intents and purposes were Kuat's government. That was one of the reasons why a great deal of Kuati citizens welcomed the new form of government with open hands. For the first time in centuries or even millennia, they did get a say in how their system was run. MK, while true, it's notable that many of the Kuati forces that returned home after Anara Kuat and company finally released them were a major factor in changing how things were ran at Kuat. Without broad support among Kuat's own naval and ground forces, such a change would have been unlikely, or at least quite bloody. That's one of the reasons for the controversy, if there are any records about what exactly led to Anara Kuat's change of heart, or how the Kuati Navy decided to support a reformation of their government and inclusion in the Empire, they're still classified. Some point at a certain meeting that's a matter of record between Generals Vale and Sash, Anara Kuat and KDY's board of directors. However, all anyone's saying is that they discussed the construction and deployment of the silencer superweapon as well as various other matters pertaining the war effort. No one has admitted that the question of a future empire or a change of the way Kuat was run was ever raised at that point. Transcript from GNN interview with famous history author Mer Kilex, The Calm Before the Storm, RK equals, Part 4, RK equals, Briefing Room Delta 1, Kuat Star Dreadnought Defender, Dark Space. Over 120 flag officers, including multiple admirals, gave me less than pleased looks when I entered the compartment. While the reasons varied, there were some they all had in common. First, up until we arrived in this place, Dark Space, light years away from Fedel, most of them were under the mistaken impression I would immediately lead them into glorious combat to kick the Separatists out of the core or something. Even those few who knew better, like Yularen and the Kuati admiral in charge of the Defender, got rather sour after a week of extensive exercises where I commanded the opposing force, usually much smaller than their own, and handled them their asses by judicious use of battle meditation and sub-formations. While certainly exhausting, it was worth it. Now, no matter how displeased everyone felt, they were all at least paying close attention to everything I was trying to teach them. Yularen was particularly sour. After all, he was the one officer in the Republic Navy who had the most time to train his forces in advanced maneuvers. However, book learning from ancient records simply wasn't enough, considering how little time he and his people had to work with and all the issues they had to deal since Palpatine got himself turned into Force Ghost. It wasn't all bad, at least. After taking out Yularen's forces during the first exercise, I did use them in most of the consequent ones in order to better train them through battle meditation. By the end of the week, we did have one fleet that, given reasonable odds, I would have taken against most competent fleet commanders of the Empire or Old Republic. That still left us with the rest of the fleet to train up, and no more than a few weeks to do it. While no doubt the crews and officers were competent, they were still too much in love with more conventional tactics, using larger formations as blunt instruments. That tended to work when we had the better ships and the enemy didn't successfully try something fancy. What I faced at the later stage of my way back home and intelligence gathered from the raids and counter-raids in the core suggested that the separatists were busy experimenting with more advanced tactics that no one has really used since the last galactic war 1,000 years ago. I smelled Perion's hand in this, or perhaps Admiral Trench was simply that good now that he was in charge, which was a scary thought. I took my seat between Admirals Yularan and Reno Panka, the man in charge of the Defender. The latter was clearly a political appointee whose primary claim to fame was being Anara Kuat's creature and thus ours. He at least was smart enough to know his limitation and listen to good advice, which put him head and shoulders above many others of his kind I've seen in the past. On the other hand, Flag Captain Belinda Koenig was competent and obviously in place to make sure such an expensive asset as the Star Dreadnought didn't get mishandled too badly. We just received a confirmation from General Kenobi. What I'm about to tell you is classified code black under code word butterfly, which meant that the fleet was already locked down under solid field of ECM and there would be no outgoing calls. I paused for a moment so my words could sink in and was rewarded with many an officer leaning forward suddenly looking very alive. It's both good and bad news. First, I now can confirm that we'll be launching a major offensive in the core in less than a month. That news made a lot of people feeling both relieved and anxious. The Quati were eager to get the enemy away from easy striking distance of their home, others felt the same or even better, they looked up to liberating their own home worlds. We however aren't tapped for that offensive, though despite what some of you might fear I didn't use my space magic to convince the powers that be to throw this fleet at the siege of Mandalore. I got a few nervous chuckles though not everyone looked quite convinced. Sometimes my reputation was a double-edged sword it seemed. Instead, we're going for something much more ambitious. A few conversations with Obi-Wan and company, some inquiries of what exactly can be produced and ready in deployment over the next month, and my original plans got expanded quite a bit. I called up a map of the galaxy and focused on the section east from the core. As of last night, Lantilles has been heavily reinforced from our garrison at Tanab and units from the Strategic Reserve. Once we've completed our exercises and added some additional ships to this fleet, we'll be using that system as a launching point for the first step of the liberation of the core. Now, some captains did look at me weirdly, while others were busy staring at the map and trying to figure out the method behind my madness. Our mission is simple. We will secure Kashyyyk, set up a forward base of operations there and use that system as the jump-off point towards our primary objectives. First, recon assets have confirmed that the Zeltro's Kona Manon pocket still holds and we will relieve our forces there by retaking Umbara. This serves two purposes, saving our people and allowing us to open avenue for attack in the core towards Kamena. Second, and of equal importance, is taking and holding Rondon. Control of that system will force the enemy to either dedicate significant forces to recapturing it or add days, even weeks, to their transit times in the region. Third, we will launch a strike towards Balamak and eventually Charos with the intention of pocketing any and all enemy forces between Ambria and Togoria. After that we would be using the forces relieved from our own pocket to reduce the cut-off enemy naval elements. Only when that was done and Kenobi was busy launching his offensive in the core I would be leading a relief force at Mandalore. Hopefully, by then the separatists would have figured they had much bigger fish to fry. Once we've secured the core, you and Kenobi intend to crush the enemy sector between Rondon, Antar and Nanthri, Yularan stated after focusing on the map for a long time. That will be one of the objectives once we've secured the core and re-established contact with the Mid-Rim Alliance. Once those two objectives are achieved, our primary targets would be capturing that triangle and, of course, Fondor. Everyone perked up at mentioning striking that system. If Fondor fell while we kept Kuat intact, the war would be basically won, with the only question being how long and expensive defeating the Sis would be. =RK equals Interlude, Historical Notes =RK equals, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the primary reasons why large parts of the Quati military and civilians alike supported the rise of the Empire and the radical changes in government in their systems was the Skyfall. We know for a fact that before that tragedy happened, KDY's board of directors, which for all intents and purposes was the power behind the supposedly democratic Kuwait government, called the shots, and they kept Kuwait's large fleet home for various reasons. While there are persistent rumors claiming that Director Anara Kuwait released a powerful part of the Kuwaiti fleet for offensive actions against the separatists a few weeks before that tragic accident, any and all declassified documents over the past 2 decades claim the same. Those units were merely sent to act as opposing force during fleet exercises between the Republic's Navy Strategic Reserve under the command of Admiral Ularan and never moved far away from Kuwait. To this day, there are various conspiracy theories surrounding the skyfall, which given the circumstances is understandable. The events on Kuwait's surface that unfolded at the same time make it easy to conclude that said tragedy was in fact an incident, but instead either sabotage committed by separatists aligned Bothan spy net agents or outright separatist hostile action. However, to this day there is no conclusive proof. Despite long, transparent and thorough investigation, there have been no evidence pointing towards anything but a tragic incident. One of the more reasonable conspiracy theories is based directly upon the events on the ground happening at the same time. What gives said theory a veneer of legitimacy were various actions committed by separatist General Gerard Perian later in the war. From The Truth Behind Skyfall, Madea Publishing House, Kuwait, =RK=, Part 5, =RK=, The Valley of the Jedi. Location classified. The Force nexus that the Force itself led Gerard to hummed with power. It was pure, so far untainted by the dark side that was busy shrouding the whole galaxy. It was the one place that could keep the Jedi Master somewhat calm lately. The knowledge what that monster veil did to his precious Kira. That very thought made him shake with rage. He felt the nexus respond to his emotions and forced himself to become as calm as possible, which wasn't working well enough if he was to be honest with himself. Perian couldn't help but feel that everything was heading towards a culmination point, one that might decide the fate of the whole galaxy, yet he was far from certain that whatever would happen would be for the better. Despite all his efforts, the mockery that was this new republic fell squarely into the hands of the Sith and those they corrupted. He should have expected it. Anything and everything Sith-like veil touched inevitably became twisted and tainted, just like impressionable young Ashar all those years ago, not to mention the way that bastard broke Padawan Wilsam and turned her into a monster. Now that the so-called Republic of this era finally showed its true colors by supporting Vale's butchery at Bothawai, the die was cast. Any chance of peace that had existed before was now gone, which was possibly the only silver lining in these dark times. Perian grimaced when he recalled the last intercepted government transmission from Kuwait. Darth Sash wearing his wife's body as a set of robes kept appearing right beside Director Kuwait. The implications were anything but pleasant. By now there was no doubt that the foolish corporate woman was fully under the control of the Sith, and sooner than later the rest of Kuwait's government would follow. What passed for Jedi of this era were broken and scattered. The Sith and their minions like the Kennebees no longer had to even pay lip service to laws, as the events on Coruscant indicated. Perian earned to lead the Confederacy forces in an offensive that would remove the Sith's taint from the core, yet he stayed his hands. Instead, he spent long hours persuading the Confederacy's leadership, both military and civilian alike, that such an act at this time would be a folly. He vividly remembered how his republic fell. It wasn't that long ago for him, after all. Whole Republic fleets threw themselves at Sith strategic worlds and had to fight and bleed through rings of defensive platforms, battle stations, local system defense forces, and finally the Sith's navy itself. The enemy had been ready for them, turned their systems into fortresses, and while some of them did fall, the price had been terrible to behold. And when the Sith's own offensive came, there simply wasn't enough of the Republic's own navy left to stop them. That damned silencer didn't help once it got deployed en masse, something that the Confederacy would be facing sooner rather than later too. It was good that his allies did listen and declined to launch an offensive into the teeth of the Sith's Republic before they were ready. Better let the traitors attack, and once their mobile forces got mauled, they could strike at Kuwait and ensure that the war would be won. At least after Sullust, the people in charge of the Sith finally listened to him and his people and began extensively training along with what few naval officers he had to improve their tactics. While they weren't up to speed yet, their forces were improving, fast, especially those under the command of Admiral Trench. Now, if he could only find a way to prevent Kuat from fully falling under the Sith's sway before it was time to neutralize that system. RK equals. Parian stood inside his command center surrounded by the most senior officers and advisors he had planet-side. In front of him hovered hollow images of Admiral Trench and the members of the Separatists' Council. The Jedi Master finished outlining his fears about Kuat and a suggestion of how the Sith's efforts there could be disrupted and waited. I must agree. While from all we know of KDY's directors, they would love to merely sell material and send volunteers, while keeping their fleet home, the Sith might be able to change their minds. After Bothoi? The few natural eyes Admiral Trench had left narrowed. The members of the Triumvirate, as they were popularly known nowadays, looked at each other sharing non-verbal messages. We are forced to concur. However, has the strategic calculus changed? The cyborg asked. If we strike now, before our next construction cycle if complete, and we have a number of our new designs operational, we're liable to suffer unacceptable casualties going on the offensive in the core. Especially if we strike Kuat, where all their supercapitals would be backed by extensive fixed defenses and the Republic's strategic reserve. That is true. Neutralizing a number of these ships would be much easier if they come to us. Admiral Trench agreed. I'm not advocating an ill-conceived offensive at this time. Parian explained. In 6 to 8 months there would be enough new construction ready to give them a realistic chance of cracking Kuat without breaking themselves upon the enemy's defenses. What we need to do is neutralize the Sith controlling Anara Kuat. I need your aid to insert myself and a strike team to Kuat. Not to mention to arrange a viable extraction strategy, because Parian didn't feel like dying before he could see Veil broken at his feet. The hollow images looked at each other and soon nodded in agreement. The Jedi Master didn't show the relief he felt. Soon he was going to avenge Kira, RK equals. Part 6, RK equals. Starlane Transport, Kuat Airspace. For most of the galaxy, the reaving of Bothoi, or whatever the media called it today, was the one singular event that drew a line in the sand and showed where everyone stood. It further divided the rotten Republic, it further reinforced the Confederacy's determination to fight for a victory because the price of defeat was now clearly terrible to behold. Some called it an atrocity, a war crime to top all others in a war already full of them. That event proved to Jared that he had been right from the start. A republic that would not only condone but support the Sith in such a madness needed to go. Most importantly, as far as he was concerned, the rape of Bothoi was perhaps the single greatest miscalculation that Veil ever did. In one fell swoop he showed the whole galaxy the kind of monster he was, revealed the true faces of those who supported him and even more importantly, drove the whole Bothan spy net in the Separatists' hands, thus making Parian's vengeance possible. Without Bothoi, Jared would have had a very hard time gathering support for his current mission, a covert strike at the heart of the Republic's most fortified system, aimed at the one of the two most dangerous people on the enemy's side. The fact that bringing Zash to justice for what she and Veil did to his wife was more important to Parian than the strategic benefit of removing a very powerful and dangerous Sith Lord from the playing field was something that those in the know willfully overlooked. After all, many an officer within the Confederacy suffered chronic sleepless nights from nightmares of Zash repeating Veil's madness above Bothoi. It took Parian months to gain authorization and support for the assassination mission, time well spent planning insertion and exfiltration strategies, putting pieces in place to facilitate a confrontation with Zash. The one thing he didn't plan in detail was what most people would consider the most important piece of the puzzle, the assassination itself. And they would be wrong. You didn't take out a Sith Lord or a Jedi Master for that matter by making elaborate plans to trap and kill them. The Force would almost always warn them. What you did was engineer a situation where they would want to fight. And if you had to engage them yourself, well, Planning how to get to the battlefield in one piece and then depart was simply common sense. In the end, the plan Perion decided upon, after he was already on Kuat and on the way to face Zash, was deceptively simple and ironic. The Sith presented themselves to the masses of the Republic as the good guys, and the very thought made Jared snort. He was about to use that fact, go after Anara Kuat, remove that pawn, and Zash would have to either come to him or flee, in which case many of the Sith supporters would see exactly how little importance their Dark Masters placed upon their continued well-being. Zash would fight and die or run, tarnish her kind's reputation even further if that was at all possible, in which case Jared would gleefully hunt her down. Perion pushed past through the wishful thinking and looked over the small strike team the Bothans helped smuggle to Kuat along with their gear. 6 experienced commandos clad in power armor sat in the back of the truck around him, weapons at the ready. Bothan agents with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exacting bloody vengeance were ready to cause distractions, and Anara Kuat, along with his real target, was just about to start a press conference, one that his apprentice attended while still maintaining her cover as a journalist. The Jedi Master closed his eyes, concentrated, and for a moment the force cloaking his very presence on Kuat flickered just enough for him to sense Deni's strum and confirm that Zash was in place. He felt the Sith's sick presence that was like a pulsing tumor in the force. Surprise flickered within her oppressive aura when she figured something was wrong, and by then it was far too late. The shield masking not only Jared but the whole truck was back in place, and a mental nudge was enough for the driver to head straight for the KDY Tower complex where Zash awaited her reckoning. Perion's face twisted in a mockery of a smile that didn't belong on the face of a Jedi. At long last, Kira would be avenged. RK equals KDY HQ, Press Conference Auditorium. Deni Sturm felt out of place. For months now she had maintained her cover, and every passing day made her wonder that the local security forces were still none the wiser about her nature. Back in the real Republic, she wouldn't have been able to keep her cover for so long. There would have been at least a dozen experienced Jedi or more helping various intelligence agencies protect a place as vital as Kuat from the threat cloaked in shadows. The security she had to deal in comparison? As long as she was subtle in use of the Force, everyone was none the wiser, though it helped that she had the support of disgruntled and now positively murderous Bothan agents. Nevertheless, she shouldn't have been able to make her way to the same room with possibly the 2 most important women currently on Kuat, even if one of them was a Sith. Especially if one of them was a Sith. Deni couldn't help it but feel that she had willingly walked in the lair of the beast and wouldn't leave without getting mauled, if she was lucky. On the other hand, she was here, within reach of the monster who wore her dead master's face and body as a spare set of robes. All her training was barely enough for Strum to keep her emotions in check without acting as a beacon for the Sith. She was furious, chock-full with righteous anger. And afraid. She was in the same room as Darth Zash, a Dark Council member, the last one still alive, a monster who had been ancient centuries before the Republic or the Jedi even knew that the Sith Empire was back. Deni had no illusions what would happen if she had to fight the monster by herself. Even now, when she had her mental shields locked down as much as possible, she could feel the sweet corrupting taint that practically came in waves from Zash, washed over everyone and everything in its path and clung to them, seeking to pervert them. When she felt a brush of her master's power, Deni almost collapsed in relief. The one person who could go toe-to-toe with the monsters who twisted and corrupted this new republic and engineered the war was here, and he would slay yet another monster just as he dealt with their emperor all those years ago. Deni couldn't keep a small, vicious smile off her face when Zash twitched. The Sith felt something, and soon she would know that her reckoning was at hand. Anara Kuat was saying something, but no one paid her any attention. Everyone in the room had their eyes on Zash, whose head suddenly twitched to look at the ceiling. Her face twisted in a grimace that had to be of horror at the realization at what was about to happen. Alarms blared, security personnel rushed towards the podium, however it was far too late. Now that he was almost here, Deni could feel her master clearly, even if she still kept her shields firmly in place. The ceiling behind her fragmented, pierced by a lance made by the Force itself, one that surrounded an ordinary-looking truck, one amongst millions of the same make on Kuwait alone. The machine decelerated sharply, smashed through the right part of the room, turning scores of reporters and Kuwaiti security into so much paste, and the only reason why it didn't do the same to Zash and Anara Kuwait was because the Sith managed to stop it in the last possible moment. That didn't help her much. An instant later, the back of the truck disintegrated and Jared exploded from a maelstrom of flying metal. He had an azure lightsaber held in each hand, and as far as Dini was concerned, he looked like an avenging angel coming down from the heavens to smite the wicked. A group of armored figures piled out after him and engaged what was left of the security forces, making sure no one would interrupt her master. One of the commandos saw her and threw a cylinder her way. Finally Dini let her shields go, summoned the offered lightsaber using the Force, and threw herself into the fray with a suicidal Abaddon.